The time has come for the Cobra to rise up and reveal himself.
Welcome back, my quiver of capitalists, to AP Economics presented by Cobranomics, your all-American history teacher, gold standard of economics, le champion of classical liberalism, and your sensei of supply side, Professor G here. And in today's lesson, we are going to take a look at how we use the full employment graph to visualize exogenous, which means outside forces, economic shocks, and how those shocks create economic gaps, and how we can use our graph to reflect these gaps with our economic indicators. Essentially showing how if something exogenous, if something outside happens to an economy, how it's represented, how it's visualized, how it takes us from where we should be, where we want to be, to away from that to where we are. And we are going to start with the first two most common types of gaps: the recessionary gap and the inflationary gap. So in a recession, this is typically created by a negative exogenous shock to aggregate demand. So that means some outside force. We were where we wanted to be. Remember, where aggregate supply and aggregate demand, aggregate supply meet, that's where we currently are. And long run aggregate supply is where we want to be. If all three are aligned, we are at full employment. We are operating on the PPC. All resources are fully employed to max and most efficiency. However, something negative happened that caused either a decrease in consumer spending, a decrease in investment spending, a decrease in government spending, and or a decrease in net exports. Sometimes it could be one, sometimes it could be multiple of these events. And whichever it was a decrease. This decrease to either C plus I plus G plus NX created a decrease in aggregate demand. That decrease took us from where we want to be, equilibrium, to at what's labeled YF, that means GDP at full employment, to the left, down to Y. And this is called a recessionary gap. The space from where we are producing, Y1, to where we should be producing, YF. This decrease in GDP is called the GDP gap. This is called the recessionary gap, meaning that you have all of this spending. We need to close this spending to get us back to where we should be, and created by this decrease in aggregate demands. This decrease in total spending in an economy has now created a recessionary gap, illustrated by at Y1, we are way below where we should be. And as John Maynard Keynes pointed out last time, because there is a decrease in spending, this is leading to a decrease in price level, which creates a movement to the left along the aggregate supply curve. As people are willing and able to spend less, businesses are willing and able to produce less, are less willing and less able to produce as the CPI decreases, because price is profit. So now you have a recessionary situation. You have GDP is low, and that situation is not going to get better on its own quickly because prices are low. So there is no incentive for businesses to produce more. So this creates the recessionary gap. Recessionary gap, YF to Y1, and as GDP is decreasing, remember the main problem in a recession is this negative GDP. As GDP continues to decrease and the economy continues to shrink, well, unfortunately, as there's less spending in an economy, businesses do not need the labor to produce if people are spending less, so unemployment will increase as we go from where we should be to negative GDP, where we currently are. For inflation, again, we are starting off at YF, where aggregate demand, aggregate supply meet at E, and they are meeting where we should be. This would be a positive increase to aggregate demand. However, with demand pull inflation, we're going to see that that positive can quickly become a negative, and you have all of the problems that are associated with inflation as it slithers and permeates throughout the economy. So demand pull inflation, this is demand pull inflation because we are going to see something positive. There's been a positive increase in spending. So either to consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, or net exports. A massive increase to either of these, or multiples of these, has increased the aggregate demand curve. The problem is, though, is the gap that is created. And here we see a gap of, we are currently producing beyond a point that is sustainable, YF. So, remember, full employment, this is our maximum production of resources. In the short run, we can produce slightly beyond the long run, but it is unsustainable because this is full employment of resources. And as it becomes more sustainable, those inflationary pressures start to increase. So there's an increase in spending. As spending increases, we are able and willing to pay more. Prices are also going to increase. But production cannot keep up with demand. We are producing beyond where we can sustain. And now here's where we have the inflationary pressures starting to really hurt society. That as we produce more, as there's this demand for production, producers cannot keep up with this demand because we're producing beyond our means. So what is going to start happening is we are going to have too much money chasing too few products. And we are going to start to feel that as an economy with these high prices. So it's almost kind of like you see two gaps here. So we have that GDP gap in that the spending is beyond the production, and spending in newly produced goods and services is beyond where we can sustain. And because it's beyond where we can sustain, we are going to start to have too much money as production cannot keep up with demand. We are going to start having too much money chasing too few products, and we are going to see the price level continue to rise to a point where it's really going to start to hurt society. So here we have the recessionary gap, and we have the inflationary gap. Now for the AP test, you have to be careful of how, if you're asked to draw these, how is the question phrased? Is the question phrased, one, an economy starts out at equilibrium, and then the situation happens? If that's how it's phrased, and then draw the situation happening. If it says to draw the situation happening, well then you have to draw, starting at equilibrium, a shift happening. Make sure you have an arrow showing the change, an arrow showing this change, an arrow showing, you should have three arrows showing the change in short-run equilibrium and the changes to GDP and to price level. Or did the question say, the situation has happened, draw where we are? In that case, you would not draw the original AD. If the question said that, obviously you wouldn't have, it would say, it might tell you to draw Y1 or P1, but this is what you would have. So if the question said something happened, illustrate where we are now, then you would draw are we in a recession or in inflation. So be careful, and then you would keep the YF, show where we should be, Y1, P1, or maybe they'll just tell you draw Y, draw P. Make sure you follow the instructions very specifically. Maybe they'll have you say PL1. So just be careful, follow all the axes. You have to have everything labeled specifically to get those full points. Just be careful. Is it saying we're starting out at full employment, and then this is happening, draw this happening, or did it happen, draw that it happened? Before we finish this episode, let's take a look at the most dangerous exogenous shock: cost push inflation. Our last exogenous shock is the most devastating one, which is cost push inflation, which creates the dual phenomenon of stagflation, which is both high price level, this inflationary increase in prices, and high unemployment, an increase in unemployment. So let's take a look at the causes, and it is only due, and it's cost push inflation, which means that it causes aggregate supply to decrease, a shift to the left. And remember, same graphing rules, left is decrease, right is increase. So it might be an optical illusion that it looks like aggregate supply is increasing. It is not. That is a shift to the left, and it is decreasing. And there are three main causes of this. One, most simply, an increase in input costs. And some input cost has increased, which now decreases the ability and willingness of businesses to produce, and therefore they have to cut back production. As they cut back production, they are laying people off, but also remember that price is profit. So as they cut back production, businesses now have to make more with less. How do they do that? They raise prices. And this creates the increase in prices, and as GDP decreases, the increase in unemployment. The other cause is there is a short-term decrease in availability of resources, and I stress short-term because remember, in all three of these exogenous shocks, notice how long-run aggregate supply stayed the same. There has been no change in any of the three exogenous shocks to the long-term ability and willingness of a nation to produce, to the long-term quality and quantity of resources or technology. So the same thing that shifts the PPC also shifts long-run aggregate supply, and again, in all three examples, where we want to be remained the same, because in each example, something other than the long-term resources changed. In recession and inflation, it was either a negative or positive shock to aggregate demand, to the four components of aggregate demand. In cost-push inflation, it would be one of these three causes that decreases the ability and willingness of businesses to produce. So the first would be an increase in input costs. The second would be that the businesses in the short term don't have the ability to produce. There's a short-term decrease in availability of resources. And the third would be, as John Maynard Keynes says, the animal spirit of business. That if there's an increase in expectations of price level, then it's in the business's short-term interest to actually decrease production now until prices increase. And this actually becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, but a negative one. Because if businesses think, well, if prices are going to increase in the future, let's decrease production now, what the business will do is decrease production now, and what does this do? This actually does cause prices to increase in the short term. And we see here that shift to the left of aggregate supply, increase in prices, decrease in GDP, creating that increase in unemployment. Remember that GDP and unemployment are inversely related. As GDP decreases, as production decreases, unemployment will increase. So, these have been all three exogenous shocks to an economy, and in our next lessons we are going to take a look at how the government uses fiscal policy, its ability to spend and to tax, and the math behind the strategies of how to use fiscal policy to best solve these exogenous shocks and to use that fiscal policy to take us from where the shocks took us in the short term back to long-run aggregate supply. We'll see you next episode. Keep the venom flowing, and remember, whether it is your money, your mind, or your body, invest hard, invest often, and no feelings. Money never sleeps.